I'm Catherine McClellan, Deputy CEO for Assessment at the Australian Council for Educational Research. For myself and my ACER colleagues, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Now, let's begin the fourth webinar in our series, Getting All Children Off to the Best Start in Life, the Big Five Challenges in Education in a Changed World. First, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points. All the attendees will automatically be muted since there are many of you and background noise can be distracting for the panelists and the others in attendance. This session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registered attendees after the session. If you have questions, please do post them using the Q&A feature of Zoom, not in the chat, because we don't want to lose good questions in an active chat log. And please do post your questions as they come to you. We may ask the speakers to respond to some of your questions interspersed with the discussion if the topic fits in. And time permitting, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar for questions we don't cover during the session. If there are questions we don't get to even after that, we will try to respond to those in writing later. The registration for the fifth and final webinar in this series is now open. The link will be emailed to all attendees after today's session, and we'll hope to see you there as well. Now, on to the content you came for. In August 2015, ACER CEO Geoff Masters published a Teacher magazine column describing 5 significant challenges in Australian education. Expanded discussion of these were consolidated into a policy insights paper that was published in May 2016. 6 years and a global pandemic later, have we made progress in meeting those challenges? This webinar is the fourth in a series with experts in each area to explore those questions. Our experts today are Mary-Ruth Mendel, co-founder and executive director of the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, Myra Geddes, social impact general manager with the Goodstart Early Learning, and ACER's own senior research fellow, Dr. Dan Cloney. These three have come here today to discuss the fourth challenge, which, as stated in the article, is around how we better address the learning needs of the many children who, on entry to school, are at risk of being locked into trajectories of long-term low achievement. They're here to share their views so we can better understand and address this issue. Let's dive in with our first question for the panelists. So I'm going to start with a fairly basic definitional question. What would it look like if all children in Australia got off to a good start in school? And what are the consequences when they do not? Dan, shall we open with you?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That's a great setup. I guess I really want to start this session by saying, you know, the 2016 report really picked up that theme of a good start at school. And, you know, it focused in on kids arriving vulnerable at school using, you know, the national headlining indicator, the AEDC. I want to extend that, and I think this group will be really, really good at extending that and saying, well, you know, let's look before we get to school. Let's look at where these challenges emerge, and let's think about what it actually looks like to get the best start in life for kids who are 0 to 5. But, you know, really where we're super interested is the 0 to 3s. And I guess I'd start with the provocation that I don't think we have a very good idea yet about what it looks like when kids have the best start in life. I say that because if we think about early childhood practitioners, government, managers, researchers, if I asked you, hey, what's the important areas of learning and development? We'd probably list off 50 different things. Now, they'd all be grouped into common areas. I think we all jump on board with the idea of holistic development being important, and we sort of generally get into the space of, you know, domain general cognitive skills, problem solving, social and emotional skills, and some of the curriculum areas around pre-literacy and numeracy. But I think if we looked a bit deeper and said, okay, well, can we describe in a common language what the trajectory of learning, what the progression of knowledge, skills and abilities for these kids looks like, we wouldn't have strong agreement, right? And part of that is because we don't have excellent measurement in this space. Now, Mary-Ruth and Myra are going to pick this up a bit more, so I won't hog the spotlight, but I will just say, you know, what do we know about kids having a best start in life? Well, we certainly do know that, you know, early childhood is an important period. And it's not just important because it comes first, right? Often we talk about learning begets learning and the cumulative nature of learning. Yep, that's certainly true. But we also know that there's a flurry of brain development for kids aged 0 to 5. Happens in different parts of the brain at different times. But, I think we're going to talk a lot about communication today. So, for kids aged 0 to 3, there is this period of, intense brain activity, exuberant synaptogenesis, my neuro friends would call it, where kids are forming thousands, millions of connections in their brain. And then over that 0 to 3 period, selectively pruning them down to come to the massive white matter that they then have to work with for the rest of their life. And so, there's this really sensitive period where we've got to get it right, ensure kids get access to really high quality early learning, and build those foundational skills. The other thing we certainly know is if we miss out, if we get it wrong at that time, it's really, really hard to go back and fix the problem. There's this really, really important period, and it's important we get it right. It happens well before kids get to school. And the only other thing I would say is, and Geoff picked this up really well in the 2016 report, in Australia, as well as globally, we have a pattern where when we do get it wrong, it disproportionately affects kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether that's living in remote areas, whether that's coming from a less well-resourced neighbourhood, families experiencing unemployment. But we have a pattern where those kids are most likely to not get the best start in life. And we know that's not the right mix. We know that's not a just outcome, and we've got to invest a lot of effort to fix it. So that was my 1 minute sort of intro to the topic. I might pass on to one of my colleagues to speak about this. Mary-Ruth, maybe you've got a few things to say.
Sure, thank you, Dan, and hello everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Mary-Ruth Mendel. I'm from the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation. We're a national charity. We exist to support children and young people and adults to reach their potential in speaking, listening, reading, writing, as Dan's just been talking about. And we do it with 7 core programs. Now, our flagship program is the Early Language and Literacy program, which is key to what the topic is here today. And in addition to that, it's a speech pathology meets early education winning combination. So it adds in all those extra elements. Who do we work with? We work with adults to work with their own children. So we build capacity in place, and we're community-led. But it all sits around the Early Language and Literacy program. And for the last 5 years, it's 5,000 children a year that we reach, and they're doing brilliantly. One of my contributions to our discussion today is to help us build the bridge between what is oral language capacity and how that is a building block, a bedrock building block to literacy skills that go on to become what children can use for their formal literacy learning. What we do know is children who start school and who are behind in oral language and what we call pre-literacy, 10 years later, 90% of them are still way behind. It's critical that in these prior to school years, we recognise that oral language development is the catalyst to literacy learning proficiency in those early years. So in the first 0 to 3, the children are learning about language. And then from 3, 4, and 5, they're drilling in and learning some of the more subtle features of language that become the decoding and the comprehension of what they're reading. And I guess all of us understand the reason why that's important, because as we all know that having an education is your passport to meeting your own personal goals and being able to, have that freedom later on in life. So critical, not just for the early years, critical for lifestyle choices as well. Myra, over to you.
Thanks, Mary-Ruth, and thanks very much for having me here today to talk about the toddlers and preschoolers, which is just fabulous. I'm joining you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people in the northern suburbs of Brisbane. And so I work for Goodstart Early Learning. And for those of you who don't know, we're Australia's largest not-for-profit provider of early childhood education and care in the country. So right now today, there's about 70,000 children across over 650 services that are getting their early learning with us. And as a not-for-profit social enterprise, similar to what Mary-Ruth was saying with her organisation, our whole purpose, the whole reason we exist, is to ensure that all children have the outcomes they need for school and life. And so what that means is we are really focused in understanding at scale and locally what works best for which children to give them the skills that they need to be successful. And like Dan was saying earlier, we've worked with international experts in child development and early childhood education like Ted Melowish and Iram Siraj and others. And one of the key messages that we got from them, and Ted actually gave me this advice about my own little boy, was communication and language is just the most important thing. If you had to pick one, it's the one that you would pick. And the strong connection between communication and language and social emotional development. Anyone who's spent time with a toddler knows that if toddlers can't communicate their needs, you have a very strong connection there straight away to their social emotional development. And we also know, as Dan was saying, that's what the neuroscience tells us. It's not just an instinct thing that early childhood educators know, it's also what the neuroscience tells us about when children's brains are developing. And so I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm just thrilled to have be able to contribute to such a robust conversation about this, because we do only have there's only a few years in a child's life to make a difference. And that's something that we're always focused on at Goodstart before we wave goodbye to that little child and they go off into school and life. And we want to have done every single day, made decisions as educators to really help set them up for success. And, to your question, Catherine, the consequences, if we miss that vital window, are really dire, and we've really let those children down if we haven't done all the things that we know we can do based on evidence to make a difference, because as Mary-Ruth said, those gaps get really, really difficult to close later in life.
Thank you all. I will ask you to now give us an update on the current situation. And one of the points of the webinar is for us to talk about what has changed and what has not changed. So what's changed in the current situation on getting all children off to the best start in life? I'd like to know things like what indicators you yourself look at. Have they changed since the report was issued? Are things better, the same, worse? Are there some bright spots? What worries you the most? And what does your own current research or your work tell us about why kids don't all get the best start in life? So Dan, I think we'll start with you again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Catherine. Look, I think the headline indicators in the 2016 report are still the headline indicators. We have the National Quality Standard, which is the tool we use for monitoring and evaluation of early childhood services. I think since the reforms that brought the NQS were put into place, we've seen generally, positive trends there. In general, in quality area 1, which is educational program and practice, where certainly I pay the most attention. We do see a general increase in the quality of programs there. We've moved from around 80% of services meeting quality area 1 in 2017. We're up around 85% now, 87% in 2020. My little note on my screen there tells me. In terms of the AEDC, look, if you read the reports, they'll say, look, there's been some small positive trends there, in the area of communication. Fewer children are developmentally vulnerable there. But I would characterize those trends as mostly flat. They're small effects. We're still working around the 22% of kids arriving at school developmentally vulnerable in at least one domain. And we still see the really strong socioeconomic status gradient where kids who live in the least advantaged neighbourhoods are most likely to be developmentally vulnerable. Kids who live in remote areas most likely to be vulnerable. kids from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, again, most likely to be vulnerable, and picking up some of those themes that Mary-Ruth and Myra were mentioning around oral language, language diverse kids, so kids who are not proficient in English, whether they speak another language as their main language or not, are very, very much arriving at school more likely to be developmentally vulnerable. So those patterns are still there. I'd suggest those patterns are still there, and we haven't got on top of this challenge because, and again, I'm going to say something provocative. I think the current mixed market approach to the delivery of early childhood services is not really set up to tackle these disadvantage related gradients. How do we know that? Well, we don't have big headline indicators, although I will note that ACER put out an occasional paper last year that showed that there was a gradient for quality relative to community SES, neighbourhood SES, with programs in the least advantaged neighbourhoods, least likely to be exceeding, and most likely to be working towards the standard. So, there is some headline evidence there, but to sort of get to that question of why we're not, achieving what we think early childhood programs can deliver, we have to rely on smaller scale research. There's been lots of it. I'm pleased to say in the last 10 years, it's been a hotbed of activity given the interest in the area and the reform agenda. I'll just hit a couple of the key findings there that I think are important. One is we know from the E4Kids study, which was a large study run between 2010 and 2015, that the early childhood market is very much a geographically constrained market. Most families use programs nearby to their homes. There's a strong effect for the advantage of the neighbourhood on the quality of the programs. And because of that, kids from the most vulnerable backgrounds tend to get access to lower quality programs. But also beyond that, sometimes are less likely to get as many hours or access programs at all. And if the purpose of the system is to help reduce those disparities, we have got it the wrong way round, where the kids who need the highest quality are least likely to get it. Other research we see, shows that there are clear differences in kids' verbal ability by the time they're 3. We observe, quite pronounced differences in kids' learning and development. In a longitudinal study, again, E4Kids study that I was involved in, when we first met kids, we could see these differences. When we reassessed their verbal ability skills just prior to going to school or in the first year of school, those differences had been set in stone, and in fact they'd grown wider. And for many kids from vulnerable backgrounds, they now were performing far below where we would expect kids of that age to be able to perform. So, we know from other studies, international studies, that early childhood programs have this fantastic potential to close these developmental gaps. We're not seeing that in the everyday market in Australia. It's likely because we've got it set up the wrong way round in terms of getting kids who most need high quality into high quality programs. But I think there are bright spots. I don't want to be the quant researcher who just harps on about trends and things like that. It is still an active area. There is new money coming into the sector. There is an ongoing prioritisation of the area. And I think one of the most positive things to emerge in the last year or two is many jurisdictions picking up the idea of 2 years of preschool being a really good idea for prioritising kids' learning and development. So again, I think I'll leave it there and maybe pass on to Mary-Ruth.
Yeah, because it follows along from what you're saying, Dan, in that if I could just take off those precious years and what Myra was saying, it's preschool is children's last chance at school. And so what we need to be able to do is to have clear visibility over where children are at in their growth story. And so, as you know, and ACER knows, for the past 4 years, we've been working together with over 500 children to actually develop what we call our growth scale for oral language and pre-literacy. And what we're hoping this will do, and it is doing it, is it'll give us some clarity over where children are up to in their growth story, which will then help educators and parents, carers, to know how that they can position what they're doing to get the most out of the time that they have with the children. So we have now developed a growth scale for children who are between 3, 5, 5 and 8 to follow them through into school. That's a really powerful feedback mechanism about children's growth. So all eyes on the children. But in order for children to grow and keep growing, we've got to have a look at, well, how effective am I when I'm their educator or I'm their carer? Am I kind of pitching too high, or heaven forbid, am I pitching too low? And children have been there, done that, got that, and they can scoot along and go ahead so much faster. So I'm really excited because the last year of our case study is this year. And we've been putting what we call the Mendel index, which we call the LD, into educators' hands in Alice Springs, into a school that has children with many, many challenges. We wanted to see 2 things. Could we finally see, not finally, but finally as in small slivers of growth, those children who are very challenged and see their growth? And could we give feedback to educators that they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. I know more about my children now. I really know how to select, my everyday activities, and through just what I was doing ordinarily with children, but salt and pepper all of these critical learning points in for children. And it's really been fabulous. The case study is giving us the heads up and the nod saying, this is going really well, doing really well. So I'm pleased to say that whilst we've got challenges in this area, we've got a little sneak peek of how we can actually keep our eyes on the children and really change that trajectory that you've been talking about, Dan. Myra?
Yeah, and a sort of a nice segue to that, I think, bringing together what the data and evidence tells us, and then what makes a difference to the educator on the ground working with the children. And that's sort of what we've been very, very focused on at Goodstart, because as Dan said, we know from evidence that high quality early learning can close the gap for children. We know it is particularly effective for children experiencing vulnerability, but we know if they don't come, you don't benefit. And we also know if the quality is no good, even if they come, they don't benefit. So we've got 2 sort of critical things there that we really need to address. And so we've invested a lot building on those existing measures. So AEDC is great, but from our perspective, that's a look back. It doesn't kind of help us necessarily know what to do in the moment. It is useful at scale for helping us to understand particular communities where we might expect to see greater vulnerability, so we can direct resources in that way. And of course, we use the NQS, but we also use our own more finely tuned measures for quality, really down to that sort of individual room level on a regular basis. And I think in its simplest terms, what we're really trying to understand is those core participation and quality drivers. So how do we ensure all children come enough to make a difference? And I think as education practitioners, we all know that just arriving at the front door is not an equal barrier for all children. Some children face significantly more barriers just getting to the door than other children. And so how do we as an early learning provider understand what those barriers are, reach out, reach into community, reach to families and address those barriers for the children and families that need them? And then how do we ensure the quality of our services? So the pedagogy practice, teaching and learning that children experience when they're with us, how do we ensure our core universal base will improve children's outcomes? And I'm pleased to say that when Dan mentioned that study that showed that low SES services were more likely to be poor quality, we ran that analysis ourselves within Goodstart, which wasn't something we'd considered doing before. And our low socioeconomic services were actually better quality than our other services. But then that posed an interesting question for us of, well, it's actually vulnerable children are everywhere and all children deserve high quality. So how do we try and lift the quality of practice across the board? So, and I think as all of us, working in, whether you're working in a school or in a national system, that's sort of the challenge, isn't it? Is to meet the needs of individual children while also ensuring at a whole of system level where we're supporting all children in a way that helps them realise their potential. I thought just the other thing that might be useful to touch on was the way that we also use a systems level kind of risk indicator. So we sort of draw on existing evidence so that every single child at Goodstart, we know if they've got risk factors or markers that mean they're more likely to be developmentally vulnerable. So it could be First Nations children, it could be children known to child protection, it could be children from low income families. And we know that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to have poorer outcomes, but it means based on evidence, they're more at risk. And then we match that with what Mary-Ruth was saying about putting the information in the hands of the educators, of the people closest to children, so that they can make those informed decisions, drawing on sort of international tools, like we use ECAZ and we use STEW to look at environmental quality and process quality, and then different assessment tools that we're experimenting with to help provide that feedback to educators, because I think that's the challenge. It's the people closest to the children that need the information to help them make a better decision today than what they make tomorrow. And as we can kind of bring together that systems information and the information that educators hold about children, that's how we're really we need to do both of those things in order to truly shift the dial and see the types of changes in the AEDC, which I think is being conducted in prep classrooms this month.
I suppose no webinar in this particular year, 2021, would be complete without asking about how the global pandemic has interacted with this issue. I can't imagine it's been helpful, but I feel that I should ask. And the other part of this, given that many of you referenced sort of measures, how do we know, or will we know, how the global pandemic has interacted with this particular issue? Myra, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'd love to. And, 2020 was, just a year like no other for us. And it really made us at Goodstart reflect that, every single day of learning matters for children. And so we've developed a dose measure so that we can track children on a week in, week out basis and check that they're on track to attend enough to make a difference. Getting back to that first point about if they don't come, we know it won't make a difference. So I think for us, what the pandemic really showed was that we need to find ways that and be more innovative in how we are driving quality improvement and supporting educators to build their capacity in the areas that make the biggest difference for children. And that's why we've got such a strong focus on communication and language in our daily practice. And I think the other thing that I have to call out is, from a positive perspective, COVID, I think, gave everyone in our society a new appreciation for what virtual learning is possible, and really investing in trying to make that work and help people understand how we can use that. And it also made, I think, everyone in our society, from the Prime Minister all the way through to mums and dads, really appreciate how essential early childhood education and care workers were. And we were the only education sector through the whole pandemic that stayed open every single day. And so, looking at our data, the trend that has really worried us is that it was across all the different points. And people might recall last year, early learning was free for quite a large chunk of time. It was children in low income households that had the worst participation outcomes at every single stage in the pandemic. So they were more likely to leave before it was free. They were least likely to take up or come back when it was free to pick up those days. And they were more likely to leave when the fees returned. And that's compared to other groups of vulnerable children. So children at risk of abuse and neglect, or First Nations children. And certainly at Goodstart, we did a lot of work to hang on to those children, but that's sort of an alarming trend that we had heard was replicated elsewhere. And we would expect that, many of those children are in schools now, and we'd expect that we'll be seeing the impacts of that picked up in the certainly ADC assessments and as that cohort flows through school. Over to you, Mary-Ruth.
Yes, well, thanks, Myra, because we would second all that you have said. And for my answer for this one, I thought that I'd bring up put the spotlight on another topic. And the difficulty that ALNF had, even though we have place-based early language and literacy practitioners, was to get the support where it was really needed. And the critical divide here was the digital divide. So for us, that digital divide created an educational divide. So we worked with World Vision to put together an analysis of what happened in that year and how come our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and particularly our remote living families, just got left out of being able to participate in virtual learning, online learning, as you say. So, on my screen, I've got some notes like 1 in 4 First Nation households do not have internet access, whether it is urban through to remote. But in fact, many families only had mobile access, and, trying to do your school lessons with your kids on a tiny little screen was just not going to work. And of course, download, upload, affordability on a mobile device when you've only got mobile internet capacity was just prohibitive. So look, it was many factors that came together that made it impossible, not just difficult, impossible for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, no matter what their level of passion was for their children, to try and keep up during the COVID time. They just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. So the COVID-19, though, that year just exacerbated what was a pre-existing disadvantage, and I feel it's kind of a little bit gone off the radar now. It's kind of like everything's okay, but it's actually not okay, because even now where services have returned, that educational gap, as we know, is still there. And I'd like to put a huge focus on it to say that we can't forget the lesson that we learnt last year. We've got to make sure that all families have access to the most modern technology so that they can fully participate in online learning. For ALNF, though, we just took a huge jump into ringing people, working through Facebook pages and Messenger, etc., all of those providers, all of those apps, and making sure that where people could be at home or could go to a school to get internet access, that we just kept our eye on the children and we worked shoulder to shoulder with those communities. But I have to say, with even delivering resources and trying to do all that we could, there is a huge and an alarming gap that will continue until Australia decides to refocus their priorities and make sure that all children have access to wonderful technology. So it's a bit of a tragedy that's still to be resolved. So yes, Dan, your turn.
Thanks, Mary-Ruth. Myra, can I put you on the spot? Because when you were speaking there and you were talking about kids from low SES households having being the least likely to attend even when programs were free, to me that set off a question in my mind immediately. Like, what are the barriers then? Like, what is it structurally that made that happen? Do you have any insight to that? Did you collect any data or?
We did, and I think the important to remember, it was a pandemic, right? So not a normal sort of year, but I think it goes to the extent to which, at a very kind of meta level, it goes to the extent to which Australians value the early years and value early learning. And so even when and value it in its own right as a thing that is worthwhile doing and worth sending your children to. So I think certainly there were challenges associated with broader economic conditions and families being worried that their future was significantly uncertain. So we had large groups who worked in industries and sectors where the future looked incredibly bleak. So retail, hospitality, tourism, and families that worked in those circumstances needed to sort of save every dollar, I think. And so from their perspective, it was, right, well, let's withdraw and let's save that money. And then when it was free, it was like, well, is it really? How long will it really be free?
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm not leaving the home to take older children to school. Like we're not out and about. We're all working from home. And we certainly did try hard to get those families back. So it was, I think, some of those other barriers, and something Mary-Ruth and I've spoken about before is, you know, if you're not currently putting petrol in the car to take your older children to school, well, do you put your petrol in the car to just take your children to early learning? And I think what we found was the answer is sort of probably no. And then I think that that ability for, you know, we haven't sort of been successful yet in getting the message across that sort of every day counts. Coming every week counts. That sort of regular, it's like school. You have to come every day, and we want to see you every day. And so I think there's also still that sort of sense that, oh, we can dip in and out, and then that'll generate the benefits. And that's certainly not what we've seen in the evidence. But I think there's certainly a cultural kind of barrier potentially about how important is it for families relative to all the other things. And then particularly for this low income group, I think when they were looking down the barrel of just very, very, very tight family budgets and uncertain, you know, wage packets, you know, for the rest of the year, it's a way you can, you know, it's a $40 out of week cost. And you just think, you know, that's, do we buy takeaway or not? Do we put petrol in the car or not? So it's not a small amount of money for families, which if the budget's tight, you would just decide that's just not a thing that we're going to do. And then I think the final pet thing, which anyone who's worked with young children knows, that it's actually not great for their routine, bringing them in and bringing them out. And so if you do try and dip in and out, you go to drop them off and they're very upset, and it takes a while for them to settle. And that's not a nice experience for children or for families. So it goes to, I think, one of the original points, which is ongoing access, affordable, you know, for the child, not dependent on what mum and dad are doing, just so those children can come. And I think if we could address that barrier, it gets easier to address some of the other barriers.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that really plays into, you know, at least anecdotally, what we hear. You know, I remember being, I won't mention where I was, but I was visiting some sessional preschools a few years ago, and in some really vulnerable communities, and speaking to the directors about why it was that it appeared they were running, you know, very short sessions, and in fact we believed less than the 15 hours a week. And the answer from them was very similar. You know, the out-of-pocket price was $10 or $12 a day for sessional preschool. And they were running a 3-day model to get the 15 or 18 hours in that they were originally running. And a lot of the families who were really struggling were saying, well, we're not going to come if it's that. And so they squeezed it into 2 days and about 10 or 11 hours in order to meet that price barrier. And I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier about this idea, and exactly what you just said about this idea that we sort of treat early years as something, well, it doesn't matter if you dip in and out and if you come for a fewer hours. And certainly we have a current pattern where, you know, the most vulnerable kids, their families face the biggest barriers to coming for more hours. And you know, we generally hold the belief that if you get more exposure to good quality programs, that's a positive thing.
Absolutely. I mean, could you imagine if at school they said on the way in the door, so how much does your mum work? Oh, not in work. You only get to come 1 day a week. How much does your mum work? Full time. Oh, you can come 5 days a week. How much do your parents work? Full time. You get to come 5 days. Like, it, you know, when you kind of break it down, it feels a little bit crazy. Yeah.
And that's really that tension there, isn't it? You know, where a lot of the policy around early years is directed towards labour force participation for parents. Rather than that commitment to education and learning for children. Because the benefits for that, I guess, from a political perspective, are 20 years down the line. They're not, you know, they're not in next year's tax receipts or, ABS stats. Yeah, that's really well put, I think, about we wouldn't stand for at the school level differential access or attendance based on what your parents do or how much money you have at home. That's really, really interesting. And sorry, I've got really sidetracked. Mary-Ruth didn't throw me talk about the effects of COVID.
But Dan, can I just chip in there and just before you go, and just say this is why ALNF would say that community capacity building is really important. And so we want to have inside the preschool gates and outside the preschool gates. And so parents and carers being really understanding and just doing some very simple things that oral language and early literacy can be, the fun part of what you're doing when you're hanging with your kids and playing with your kids and doing everyday activities with your kids. And we find that parents kind of don't quite get that, oh, you mean do things like this? And it's like, yeah, they're perfect. And so you don't have to be kind of like a Rhodes Scholar to be able to do these things for your children. You can do them, grandmas, grandpas, mums and dads, aunts and uncles, carers, playing with siblings, playing with their younger children. And that's incredibly nourishing, and then backed up by the early years. So I'd cast the net a little broader, make sure that we include that in our dialogue too.
Yeah, that's really true, isn't it? I guess the only commentary I'd make about the effect of COVID, given the brilliant responses you guys have made right down on the ground in communities, in services, is to try and take it back up to the macro level a bit too and say, we're going to get to the end of the pandemic soon, we all hope. And what will be true is we won't be able to say with any certainty what the impact was for young kids, except when they get to school. And, like we talked about earlier, then we find out they're behind. So I'd just like to reiterate that idea that because we don't have a common understanding about the progression of learning across the early years and how that does literally connect. It's not that early learning is something separate and then kids get to school and they start a different mode of learning. The Mary-Ruth, the things you talk about, kids' oral language, the acquisition of vocabulary, their ability to sequence ideas, to hold on to information, to build narrative, all that sort of stuff lives on the same continuum as school-age literacy, right? They are the antecedent skills. And because we don't have that common understanding and the links into the measurement we do when kids get to school, we're not going to have at a national level the data to say, geez, the real sensitive period was for the 1-year-olds who missed out for 6 months. And so I think, because I'm going to hopefully get a chance to get up on my soapbox a bit more about this, but I think there's a real opportunity for us to start pushing up into the school sector with better ideas about how we can do measurement of early learning and development, talk about the progression of skills and how educators, Myra, exactly like you were saying before, and Mary-Ruth, talking about your case study work, how do educators target kids at that right level, and make sure their practice is right where kids need it.
Because the children have gotten taller, but their oral language and their early literacy formative skills haven't kept pace. And so you just can't jump in at this upper level and go, well, hum a few bars and you catch on. Oh, you didn't catch on? Oh, well, I'll do it again and again and again, because what's sitting underneath it is building blocks towards that. So you have to be able to cast your skill set back, pick up those lost stitches and then, keep the knitting going. And you've got to do that in a really informed way. I don't think we'll get clarity over the COVID pandemic influence on early years learning and how it affects schooling for a very long time. And then I think there's got to be a big focus on, fix up, catch up and keep up. Yeah, very much so.
I think our next question is probably a good follow-on to this one. The 2016 article cites a couple of factors. It says universal access to high-quality, affordable, integrated early childhood education and care. We've just been discussing how universal that access is or is not and what's happened there. The other half of it's interesting as well. Delivered by qualified early childhood educators with well-developed understandings of child development, health, and safety issues. And so the broad question for all of you, are those descriptors appropriate for describing the situation in Australia? And if they're not, where are we falling short? How do we know? How do we diagnose our problems? So Dan, let's start with you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to try and get out of the way really quickly on this so that Myra and Mary-Ruth can answer, because I think they're doing some really interesting work in this space. But I guess I'd say, from the perspective of universal access to high quality, we picked up some of those issues earlier, and I'll just say it again for posterity's sake. I think we've got it wrong in the current system where we don't have a system that ensures that the kids who need it most get the highest quality programs. And like Myra was just talking about, in fact, there are a whole range of barriers that mean that those kids might miss out altogether, get exposure to few hours, all that sort of stuff, which is really problematic. I'd really like to focus in, though, on that idea of qualified early childhood educators and having a well-developed understanding of child development. And there, what I would just say is I'm going to talk more about this idea of thinking about learning from 0 to 12 or older, and putting it on a common continuum or progression of learning. But we've done some work for the VCAA recently, and you can jump on the VCAA website and see our lit reviews, but it was around assessment of the learning areas in the VELDF. And what we found there is, once you sort of excluded the measures that are available to clinical professionals, to psychologists and speech pathologists, once you took away the measures that cost thousands of dollars or require, flying to the US, for example, to get training on, the measurement available, the assessment available to early educators really is a bit stark, a bit sparse. Sorry, I should say. There's lots of, kind of checklist measures. Not much of it is taking that kind of learning progression perspective on learning, thinking about what it looks like to learn. Often you just get some sort of number out of the measurement. And I think if we want educators who are developmental experts and who really understand, what oral language development looks like, what growth in social and emotional skills looks like, we need to be developing new measures that start from that perspective. What is the theory? What can we do to get experts together and describe the typical progression? What knowledge, what skills are developing over time within quite explicit domains, and then hinge our measures on that. And Mary-Ruth, it's very much at the core of the LD, the measure that you're developing and putting in the hands of educators. So, I think that's really where the crux of it is. If we want to get educators who are, really, really highly skilled, highly valued professionals in that area, it's building that common language and understanding about what development looks like within these discrete areas, giving us a common language to talk to each other. Again, pushing that up into school. This doesn't have to be something where we're taking assessment from schools down into early years. Doing it in authentic ways, built around back and forth exchanges between adults and children, picture book activities, reading, that sort of thing is how we can do the assessment, collect the data. I'll leave it to you, to Mary-Ruth now to pick that up, because I'm sure she'll have a ton to say about it.
Well, that's our bread and butter, Dan. As you know, we're a really practical charity, and we work with assistant teachers, with usually those who don't have a formal qualification and possibly never would step into that space because their own literacy is low, but have a great love for children and a real natural knack with children, are attracted to this sector you know, for their jobs. What we've been working with is place-based, authentic place-based training, mentoring, and on-site integration of skill sets, so that people build up a skill set around oral language and early literacy, become really knowledgeable in how to help children, how to, you know, think about literacy and oral language for themselves, but then how to sit that beside, and maybe they are educators and they do have formal instruction, how to sit, you know, these strategies beside what they already know and integrate it in. And we've found that because the speech pathology meets early education, that has been really useful to just keep our eye on the story of the child's growth through the LD, but making sure that the safe hands around the children are actually, you know, people who are really involved in the children's neighborhood, in their really want these children to progress and do well and have passion for the children, but also have a skill set. Now that sits beside the LD in a very special way, because there's no good using any viewing of children's growth if you don't know how to do the next thing to push them along and to and to stimulate them so that they are growing. Otherwise, we're just going back to that thing of measuring the baby. You passed, you failed. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just hope that a bit of hit and miss will help out here. No, we've got to be more dedicated to the child's growth and be really informed. And I don't think that that's an impossible undertaking for Australia on a federal level, state or local government level, because it's the story of what ALNF has been doing as a charity. And to put that to scale is not really a problem. If people want to look up the Early Language and Literacy program, it's a nationally accredited program, it's an ACER program. You'll see it on their site, and it'll show you all of the kind of things that we teach people, and it's a certificate for, so it's a valuable contribution to people's career pathway as well, which is the kind of sleeper here. It's that early educators are just there to look after the children. It's a bit like Myra was saying, you know, if we're sending children to preschool, you know, what's the value of that? Or they might as well stay home because we're all at home during the pandemic and not send them. No, and I think we've got to tell the story of those educators who are around children can in fact have some really exquisite skill sets and have that known within the communities around the children, the neighbourhoods, because they are people of those communities and neighbourhoods, that they're very clever and those children are flourishing. And I think that will, you know, that's something that Australia needs to address right now. So that's my soapbox.
Very good. And look, I think the thing that you know, when we reflect on that statement from 2016, I think it's really important to acknowledge the tremendous work that educators working in early childhood education and care have done over the last decade. Because if we wind the clock back to 2010, you didn't have to have a qualification to work in early childhood education and care. And so we have huge swathes of our workforce that have undertaken their Certificate 3, have undertaken their diploma, have studied their bachelor. And it's because, as Mary-Ruth said, these are people who are deeply, deeply committed to children and committed to children's learning. And so, and like Dan was saying at Goodstart, you know, we're very interested in measurement because you know, our purpose is that children have the outcomes they need for school and life. And so how do we know if we've done that or not? How can we look children in the eye and say, we've done everything we can to try and help you on that journey? And I certainly don't, it's not simple. It's not, you know, if it was as simple as weighing the baby, well, we'd do that, but it's not. It is complicated. And I think when we similarly looked at different tools and things, we found lots of great tools and assessments that would be very useful if you were a speech pathologist or a, you know, child psychologist specialist or had a PhD in something. But when we were trying to find things that a Certificate 3 educator could use that would be useful for them that would help tell them something about children that they didn't already know, that was very challenging. And so, but we have found some tools that we're using, and because, as we discussed earlier, the clear kind of evidence about the benefits of communication and early language skills, that's the area where we're really focusing on, and focusing from little babies, because all children communicate. Babies communicate, and there's serve and return interactions. There's things you can do with babies to build those early communication skills. And so I think, you know, one of the challenges we have even in the early years is this sense that, oh, well, it's preschool, or maybe it's 2 years before preschool. When if you actually think and you follow the neuroscience, it's babies. And how do we support home learning environments? How do we support communities? How do we support the early years? And so I think that, you know, I think the challenge for all of us as, well, I certainly take this on as a challenge for myself, and I think other people who don't work frontline with children, is the challenge for us is to try and simplify it, get it reliable for the people working closest to children, because Certificate 3 and diploma qualified educators, and even, to be honest, many bachelor qualified teachers don't have huge elements of child development as part of their university training. And so the degree to which they actually have that core foundational knowledge is something that's variable. And so the challenge for us, I think, collectively then, is to continue to work to develop the tools and systems that can be used at scale, that are truly useful and meaningful and powerful for the people closest to children. Because we know from our work with educators and teachers, if you get that bit right, people will pick it up and they'll run with it and they'll fly. But I can also tell you that if it's not useful, if it's not simple, they will put it down and they will focus on other things that their experience tells them is more important. So that bringing educators and the people closest to children on the journey and genuinely listening to them about what's most useful, I think, is the other important ingredient when we're thinking about how do we try and get steps closer towards that 2016 statement.
So Myra, I'll tell you a little story here about in our case study. So we're using the LD, and we had visibility over children who were just stepping into school, and many children not being in a learning site at all. And the educator gave the feedback to us that she knew exactly where the children were in their developmental journey. She'd been able to spend time thinking about all of those children. She knew the strategy she was going to choose, and how she was going to group children up or manage different classroom activities. And she said to me, I've got the quietest class that I've ever had of children just stepping into school, that she'd ever had, because those children were just switched on to learning, because she was at the right level for each one of those kiddies. So instead of going to school and disconnecting and getting naughty and just going, this isn't for me, I don't, you know, this is, I can't do this type thing, all of those children were having really productive days, and she was just so thrilled, and we are too. So it's all very doable, even in really challenging circumstances. And that's where I want to see it head. In those really challenging circumstances, those children, equity means they need a lot of help too, practical, and so do their educators. So yeah, the story will go on. Stay tuned.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, which I'm sorry to say, because I'm really enjoying the discussion. So I'm going to ask you my sort of favorite last question. If you've got unlimited resources, unlimited whatever you needed, people, hands, time, money, whatever the thing was that you required, and you could go in and change one aspect of this problem, one thing that would have lasting impact on children's language or development, what would it be? You have relatively short time. I'm sorry, I've only got a couple of minutes, but let's go ahead and start with you, Dan.
Yeah, and look, I might try and wrap this in to also answer. I saw a question from Amy Christensen in the chat. And what I'd say is, look, you know, in many ways, we've got to keep taking advantage of the interest in the area, the focus. You know, if we can look to our neighbours, you know, just last week, the federal government in Canada committed $30 billion of new money on top of what the provinces are already spending to guarantee universal $10 a day childcare within the next 5 years. It really does it really does come down to a money problem in many ways. You know, we need that serious investment where we're investing at least what we spend on kids in the primary school, secondary school sector in the early years, preferably more. But there's obviously stuff going on there as well that we have to pay key attention to, measure and report on, and actively work to change. And that is that equity stuff. So there is a risk when we just bring money in and provide new services that we do end up with what we've got now, where there are strong equity issues. Well, we do have to then get explicit and commit to overcoming those and making it an absolute right of kids from any household that they can expect very high quality programs and that they won't face barriers to, you know, if they want 5 days a week of childcare, it's not going to be the price that holds them out of there. It's not going to be the fact that someone at home is experiencing unemployment that keeps them out of that learning experience. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to Myra, I think.
Fabulous, thanks Dan. I'm going to be cheeky and ask for two because I'm an ex-political staffer, and that's how you make sure you get at least one thing. And so the first thing is absolutely we should be able to promise to every single baby born in Australia that you will be able to attend up to 5 days of really high quality, inclusive early learning in your local community that really works with your family to set you up for success in school and life. And we would make sure that the children from the most vulnerable households actually get the best of the best. So we would have people in high income areas driving across town to try and get their children into those services. So if I could have one thing and resource wasn't a problem, well, that's the one thing that I'd have. But I think the other thing that we need to think about is, as a sector, we need to get better at innovating in how we provide expert, short, sharp, snappy, powerful, professional development advice to the people closest to children. And, I sometimes jokingly say that, I'm not saying we should be like Kim Kardashian, but we shouldn't be not like Kim Kardashian. And there are things we can learn from social media influencers, from big corporates like Apple or those organizations who are really effective at delivering messages, at building a movement and sharing information. And I think, that's something that we've got to get better at, how we can do that for the people closest to children, because just in case my first thing doesn't get delivered, I think that would be a good fallback for us to think about.
And for me, it would be universal free access to quality professional development, sitting beside universal free access to the LD scale so that they can have clear visibility over understanding their children, and then be able to select from loads of quality strategies and resources in oral language and pre-literacy to ensure that there's evidence on the children's growth and hand them over to school who can carry on their story successfully. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing, because I know Catherine's going to wrap up really quickly because we're already a little bit over time. But I did really want to say that I've come in here and ACER's put a wonderful webinar on. I've been able to stand here, and pretend I'm the world's expert in early years, but I really wanted to pay tribute to the other experts in early childhood at ACER who are doing this work, and to senior management who's putting a focus and a priority around early years. In particular, the people who are influencing my thinking: Prue Anderson, Kelly Picker, Danielle Anzai, Pam Munro-Smith, Sandra Knowles. These are fabulous early childhood experts who are doing this work every day. And also to my colleagues at ACER in Indonesia, who have made this a strategic area for us to work in. It's really nice for me to come here and talk publicly about it. But behind the scenes, there's the expertise that's really driving the innovation and the growth in this area, and they need a shout out, I think. So back to you, Catherine.
So thank you all of you. I hate to have to cut this off. It's really been fascinating. Thank you so much. I personally have learned a lot, so I am very grateful to our panelists and to the audience. We got questions. So thank you to everyone and to all our participants. We hope to see you for the next webinar in the series, which will be the last one. It is the 19th of May, Wednesday at 4 p.m., Raising the Professional Status of Teaching, and we will see you then. Thank you very much.